Mental health is complex, not easily definable, and certainly not solvable in conventional methods. It was at this moment where the Ortus Foundation was formed to try to make a difference. That's okay. Try to make a difference out of a burning desire in my heart to help family, children, and the community. Ortus in Latin means to rise up, and our mission is to illuminate pathways for youth mental health and is now underway. We are a partner in mental health advocacy, an impact and grant giver, an investor, and a change maker. We are working on several initiatives, including collaborating with higher education on their mental health policy, helping build capacity with direct services, and directing early stage investing with companies whose mission aligns with healing, profitability, and responsibility. We also support the movement in the use of psychedelics in therapy. And we've taken a deep dive into practices in the field where we found that many practitioners in the mental health space, from researchers to therapies, are all working in different silos. The opportunity tonight is about inspiration and connection, and it's for us to be inspired by our esteemed speakers and for a chance to gather, share, and engage with a variety of networks and advocacy. The only way we can actually scale impact, whether it's through research, policy change, or direct services, is that we actually communicate, lean in, invest in the problem, and collaborate. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome our first speaker, Peggy Lim. Peggy received her undergraduate degree in finance and international business from NYU's Business School of Stern, and after a successful financial career at Chase in New York City, went on to receive her master's in early childhood and elementary education at NYU. I'm deeply honored that Peggy is here today and to help us understand firsthand the changes that need to happen so we can deliver on the promise for our youth of living in a mentally healthier world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. And deepest thanks to you and the Ortus Foundation, and you're committing your time and your resources to saving lives and improving the quality of life for our young children and their families. You have gathered an impressive audience here tonight to combat this epidemic that has taken a grip on our children's minds and bodies and taking them from us. Young and I are grateful for your leadership, your friendship, and for your commitment to the cause of youth mental health. We hope that this symposium is the first of many in raising awareness to the war we are battling and the sense of urgency to find solutions and gain the upper hand. As Sabrina noted, I am speaking to you today as a parent who has had firsthand experience with these issues, as well as an educator who had worked with multiple institutions, practitioners, and providers that are alleged places of support. We were a family of 4 until May of last year. We lost our younger son after a very long fight with anxiety, OCD, and eventually an eating disorder. There were many interventions, some helped, some not. From the time our son was in 5th grade through his first year of college, I've done an extensive amount of field research, and I sit before you as an informed person who has seen and experienced systems that have worked. I've also seen and experienced others that have not. This journey has led to meeting many parents and families dealing with a range of mental health issues, and I've helped them navigate those systems. Out of no choice of my own, I am called to action. It is based on this experience that I am committed to working towards finding solutions and for working towards finding change. True and lasting transformation can only happen if we are horizontally and vertically integrated in the school system. What would this look like? A multidisciplinary team at school, not just the counselors, that includes parents, students, teachers, and faculty, along with staff. Our children spend their most amount of waking hours at school, and school-related activities. So the people with whom they are with most of their time outside the home should be trained on what to look for and what to do. Teachers must be taught how to interpret what they're seeing in their students and know where to direct them when flags are raised and when alarm bells go off. The home-school connection is key, partnering from preschool all the way through college. Partnerships and collaboration between parents and schools, both informal and, more importantly, formal, to strengthen the protocols and systems of the mental health support for our children. Based on my family's experience, the strong sense I have is that institutions are so concerned about litigation, they avoid doing what needs to be done, what should be done. This fear acts like handcuffs, which then dictate and limit what they are doing, what they are willing to do, and for the lives they have been entrusted with. Allow me to share the 3 questions the speakers were asked to address today. What myths need to be debunked in the space you are working? Where are the voids in discussions or partnerships that need collaboration? Where are the greatest near-term opportunities for transformational impact? Myths, voids, opportunities. I will start by addressing myths. Myths we hear, myths we are told, and myths we repeat. Specifically, myths that arise in the transition from high school to college, as this is an identified crack. It is during this transition from high school to college where a lot of problems come to light. Problems that were dormant, or ripples that shift in an instant to waves or tsunami. Here is some expert advice I was given. What student needs to do is go see a counselor. Well, there's a 4 to 6 week wait to see someone, when 4 to 6 weeks or 4 to 6 minutes is too long to wait. The ER is not a good option, but very often the only alternative. You just need the right medication. Many take 4 weeks to become effective, and you don't know it'll work. There are side effects to every medication that vary from person to person, as well as effectiveness. Your child just needs to go to a program. Most are at capacity with a wait list that can be months long, and they can be quite cost prohibitive. Your child should take a gap year. This is merely a deferral of a problem by the institution, leaving the student's parents with no structure, no plan, no help. A scary myth. There is a safety net in high schools as well as college. Someone is paying attention. These myths or cookie-cutter solutions lead to voids and have brought us to the current dire situation. We cannot continue like this. The current response to this ever-deepening crisis is insufficient, and we are complicit. Sometimes I find an image or an analogy can help understanding something more readily. As I thought about a way to describe what is missing, what young people really need, I thought about when my son learned to walk. First came the combat crawl, then the upright furniture hold, then a hand, to a finger. And in a moment, he was off on his own. The imagery of this analogy is an example of what I think is missing in the K-12 settings and when we pass off our children to colleges and universities. It's a significant void that needs to be addressed. Some other voids I would like to share with you. I find it difficult to understand. Young people can drive at 15, vote for the first time at 18, buy a gun at 18, drink at 21. It seems arbitrary. It seems you reach a certain day and magically, you're all ready. But as we know, this is not the case. Most young people are not ready to manage their own care, especially medically, at age 18. In my experience, a majority of institutions are also not ready to receive students. Colleges need to be prepared from day one for a range of readiness in the incoming student body and have a plan in place to meet the needs of the least ready. Parents believe they do a good job, then their children will be fine. You may feel like you have a handle on things, but then something shifts. Sometimes you see it coming, many times you don't. All you can do is provide guardrails, but make no mistake, you do not have control. You really never have control. Young people did not get the needed exposure or experience to pivotal skills. Social media and COVID only exacerbated this. Yet we give young people agency when they're not ready for it and without the skills to ask for help. They need trained people around them to recognize, in a timely manner, if someone is in need and guide them to the resources. We need to err on the side of caution and safety. They also need to be taught, not simply told, to ask for help in order to become independent and to advocate for themselves. It is clear they are not equipped to do so. Even if they are, there is a wait for the help, and they do not know to access the help in a new environment. So many give up, suffer, and some die. It seems to me that school administration's intent and student experience are not aligned. While many of these institutions have the financial means, the allocation is not as targeted as it should be. If mental health is such a concern for them, then why is funding not a priority in the way other areas are, such as athletics and tech? Of the resources offered, a number of questions come to mind. Why are they not accessed by students who are at risk? Which ones are not needed or should be replaced? What are the barriers? Where is the data on why resources are not accessed and help identify what the barriers are? We pull endlessly on politics and other issues, but why are we not pulling on this critical issue and using the data for life-saving change? Some of these young people come from families with resources that can fill in the gap, but many do not. As a parent who is not trained in mental health, I needed to become an expert overnight at navigating this system, and it was a steep learning curve. An important void: parents, the people who know their children the best as they shift from home to college. Why are institutions not leveraging the parents in supporting the student or being connected to one another? Let's be strategic in how to align the two sides better: resources with the end user, voids, and opportunities. These are strategic interventions where we could and should put our energy and resources. Legal, healthcare, and educational systems are to name a few. These are just a handful of the voids in the youth mental health arena, and each one is a potential opportunity. When I think of other opportunities, available resources come to mind. Resources which can be a lifeline to helping your child, but students and parents are unaware or uncomfortable using them. Let's address the perceived stigma attached to admitting you need help. We need to find a way to overcome the stigma. Perhaps social media could have some good use to it. I'd like to share a quote by Sabrina. Don't be afraid to ask. Your opportunity for change is contingent upon the support you have access to. Without support, we don't develop resilience when facing difficulty. We develop trauma. This is at the very crux of the issues. People are afraid. We need to address the fear, shame, and ignorance by making systematic changes to the way the help is presented and provided. Just reminding people not to be afraid does virtually nothing. This is a message not only to the educational institutions, but also the parents. It's not only the schools that are failing our children. Parents can do a better job. We can also do a better job of helping each other to prepare for and through the transition from high school to college. Parents are a grossly underutilized resource in helping our young people. Establishing parent networks that can help communicate to and with institutions could have a tremendous impact. As a parent whose child was struggling, talking to other parents having similar experiences provided both meaningful insight and a sense of relief at not being the only one. A parent network would strengthen the sense of community and lessen the isolation for parents whose child is struggling. Another opportunity, online info sessions, recorded parent orientation that covers available resources and shows you how to help your student access them. Helping parents help prepare themselves, then to help the students help themselves for a successful launch to college as possible. This would be consistent with most philosophies at schools, or most schools with this philosophy, empowering the students, but also permitting parents to provide a helpful nudge or clear directions to already overwhelmed and vulnerable students. This is done for the transition to high school in a variety of ways, and it should be done as soon as the student accepts an offer to a college. The next critical time to connect parents would be when they arrive on campus for drop-off before orientation week. Many may be on campus less than 10 times between first-year drop-off and graduation. So that first time on campus could be a significant in-person touch point. Then there's professional development, training for faculty and staff, not just for the understaffed, overworked counseling department. Train more people, then compartmentalize and expect the students to ask for help. Finally, there are ways to use the residential housing system strategically. Think about each residential college as a community and how best to support it. This could start with the matching of roommates, then to residential colleges. If there's a lack of fit, then make a change sooner rather than later. The housing process and system does not need to be so rigid. Leaving young people to figure it out on their own, figure out how to get along, is no longer a viable strategy. I would argue it hasn't for quite some time. By no means am I suggesting that parents be given full access. I am suggesting ways in which parents can help institutions help their students be as safe as possible and increase the odds of a successful launch into the next stage of life. Based on my experience, these are some ideas that would allow for transformational impact to happen. Think of the analogy of learning to walk and the hand. These are opportunities for significant but guided change. A hand reaching out as our children learn to walk in a completely new environment with new terrain. To close, I was as involved of a parent as could be. That did not lack in love, motivation, or resources, yet I still lost my son. Unfortunately, I am drawing from experiences that are not unique to me alone. It is harder and harder to find families that are not touched by mental health challenges, and yet many are still hiding it. As difficult as it was to agree to be here today, my hope is that together we can ignite a chain reaction to fill the known gaps needed by our young people to stay alive and have a chance for a healthier and better future. I'd like to share a quote that moved me deeply. It's a quote from Trina De Niro, Robert De Niro's daughter, about the loss of her young adult son. You were so deeply loved and appreciated, and I wish that love alone could have saved you. Only by leveraging the resources of parents and educational institutions can we begin to have an impact. I also believe that elite institutions, K-12 and higher ed, can role model the necessary change. This would be an incredibly powerful catalyst to initiating the chain reaction that is so desperately needed. The status quo is not acceptable. Actually, it's unconscionable. Our children need and deserve an urgent call to action to identify targeted solutions that can be implemented as soon as possible. We can no longer allow our young people to live with such pain and suffering. Thank you.
Next, I'm very excited to introduce to you John MacPhee. John is the CEO of the JED Foundation, a leading non-for-profit organization that protects emotional health and prevents suicide for teens and young adults. JED works across the country with families, schools, youth, and community organizations to take action to support youth mental health. John advises several organizations, including S.J. Levy Fellowship for Future Leaders at City Colleges, Trek Medics, Opera Ebony, and the Health Policy and Management Department at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. John is a recipient of the Alan Rosenfeld Alumni Award for Excellence in the Field of Public Health from the Joseph Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. He received his BA from Columbia College, his MBA from NYU, and his MPH from Columbia University. I'm continuously impressed by the impact JED is having on schools and larger communities, higher education, under John's leadership. John?
Thank you so much, Sabrina, and thank you, Peggy, for sharing your story. I was saying that the comprehensiveness of Peggy's recommendations, which we wholeheartedly support at the JED Foundation, made me think of the book that you're giving away in the front, Rethinking Suicide, which I recommend everybody read. The book describes suicide as a wicked problem, a very complex, wicked problem, and it requires, therefore, a multi-layered, comprehensive, sort of all of society response, and that is, that is what Peggy's saying. There's so many statistics, and so one of the ways that I like to frame statistics around what's happening with young people is just to imagine that we, as a group, there's about 50 of us. Just imagine it's September that we're 50 high school students at the beginning of the year in an assembly or in a class, right? By the time the year's over, 21 of us will have felt persistently sad or persistently hopeless, okay? 8 of us will have been bullied in a significant way online. 9 of us will have made a suicide plan. 5 will have attempted suicide, and 1 person in this room will need significant medical attention for that suicide attempt, right? And so that's a lot in just one room of 50 people when there are millions and millions of student and youth across the country for that, for those statistics to be multiplied out. Young people, we do a lot of research with young people, and I'll talk about what JED does in more detail in a moment. But I think it's important that we recognize that there's a lot happening today, and there's a lot of pressures and stressors on young people that are different than in the past. And I would argue today's young people not only are they not snowflakes, they're actually quite resilient in dealing with more issues than in a long time, if sort of ever. And I think it's important we recognize that. So some 20% of young people are going to experience an emerging mental illness every year, and have major depression or panic disorder, OCD, right, an eating disorder. But in addition to that, they're feeling absolutely enormous pressure around succeeding in life and whether or not they will succeed in life, around finding their sort of individual self. There's just enormous pressure on young people to be their unique, authentic self, but in a way that others aren't, right? And that really, really weighs on them. They're spending less time face-to-face with other people, with families and dinners, dating, than previous generations ever did. And the quality of their sleep is compromised more than previous generations. And they're afraid of school shootings and police violence and racism and climate change. And so it's a lot, right? And yet they're also an extraordinary generation. They care deeply about making the world better. They care deeply about helping other people. They're willing to talk about mental health. I mean, the building blocks among young people are such that really they should be leading, right? And I think our job as allies is around how do we help them and help them access the networks and the sort of positions of power that we have, but we need to follow them. And also make sure that our legacy stigmas are in check and that we're setting up the systems and the culture of caring around them. And no one, absolutely no one is immune from these pressures and these circumstances. So what at the JED Foundation we do aligns very much with what Peggy talked about. We are a nonprofit that focuses on helping schools and school systems put these kind of comprehensive approaches in place as a strategic advisor to schools. So I'll walk you through that. The idea is this, that mental health should be a named priority, right? And it should be among the top 3 or 4 priorities of the school. And that's only going to work if leadership does that, right? And to recognize it, even if you know you're a leader at a school and what you care about is reputation and graduation and rankings. Well, mental health is a leg on the stool that is necessary to be able to achieve those outcomes. And so then there needs to be a plan, just as Peggy said, a team that oversees mental health, a multidisciplinary team. And this is really important to make sure that all the voices, including students, are at the table, but also for sustainability, because there's just turnover, people leave. And so there need to be systems that can be durable. We help schools, and when I say this, I'm talking about pre-K through 12 districts. We operate at that level, high schools and colleges, survey students. So really understand what's going on at the student level. You've got to talk to them, you've got a focus group with them, and you need data. During COVID, we worked with a number of schools in the Northeast, high schools, and our data showed that their Asian and Asian American students were being bullied and harassed about COVID in extremely high numbers, as just one example. And the school leaders and administrators had no appreciation of it. You need the data to be able to understand what's happening to implement actions. And so then when we talk about in a public health language, a multi-tier system of support, it's an organizing principle, right? Because very often schools do have a lot of good programs, but there might be sort of missing pieces. And so the things we help schools look at are the development of life skills, right? So what can be done to help students with life skills like time management, knowing how to manage money, advocating for themselves, these kinds of things, and before high school, doing things like spending time away from home, right? So that you can get sort of used to those experiences, social emotional skills, these kinds of things. And then second is about connectedness and creating a culture of belonging, right? Because the extent to which we feel like we belong is protective as opposed to feeling isolated. And there's a whole lot that can be done in that space. And it's I'll give you just a story of a school in Montana that we were with. They were like, we have no money. We're a rural school. We can't do anything. So all we do is we've assigned every adult in the school a group of 10 students that they follow and monitor and watch and maintain relationships with. And we're like, well, there may be nothing more powerful than that, actually, right? And so this kind of work, it doesn't necessarily have to cost money. It's about the culture. And And in that, actually, when it comes to connectedness and belonging, also the faculty and staff are critically important, right? We need to think about their well-being. They've just been through it, in so many ways. The third domain is about promoting help-seeking and help-giving, right? Reducing stigma. I'm going to come back to the concept of stigma, but a culture where it's okay not to be okay, and that young people know where to go and they feel comfortable doing that. So as an example, in New York City, we created a program with New York City called Let's Talk. So New York City went out to all their schools, to all the adults in the school, and said, if you're willing to be a safe harbor that young people can go to, raise your hand, right? And so some 500 or 600 adults, different staff and faculty did that, and then we trained them on how to have conversations about mental health, and they wore Let's Talk buttons and Let's Talk Zoom backgrounds. And there was a campaign to the students so the students could see, oh, I can talk to that, that adult. They want me to talk to them, right? And so that's a way to try to promote, help seeking. The next area is around identifying students who are struggling. And so here, are there anonymous systems, anonymous as possible, where students can say they're worried about another student? Where, how do you think about disciplinary issues? If a student's acting out, what's wrong? Not, oh, they need to be in front of a disciplinary committee. Are they missing school? Are their grades changing? By the way, grades going up is a warning sign, right? Because the student's trying to take control and sort of focus on what they can control. But if the grades are going up a lot, that's worth a check-in. So, these kinds of structures that can be put in place. And then it's very hard to access care, unfortunately. So really helping to look at, once you know that a student needs help, how do you engage the family? What are those protocols, right? And respecting the complicated issues around, when and how to go to families. But I totally agree with Peggy that because of the fewer circumstances where the family might be a problem in some way, families are sort of held at bay, a lot when they really, really can be helpful. And that's not easy to navigate for schools, but being really purposeful around that. Then what relationships are in the community? When and how can you refer students to those clinicians? Having MOUs in place, telebehavioral health, how do you augment? So I don't know if this level of detail is too much or not.
No, it's not.
Okay, all right, well, thank you.
You're speaking to the choir.
Okay.
A lot of similarities here.
And then in the protocols and the procedures, and again, yes, this young person's 18, so, making sure that in high school, the families and the young people know you're turning 18. So what we tell young people is, you're turning 18, that means that information cannot be shared with your family until and unless there's a threat to you or someone else. And that is an extremely high standard. We recommend to young people, you need to sign those proxy forms. And it could be your grandmother, it could be your sister, but somebody who loves you needs to be in a position where they're going to be called more freely and easier. But kids go off to college and they don't know, and families don't know, and so this kind of education. And then there need to be crisis protocols in place, unfortunately, like planning in advance for a tragedy, and so, the whole response system is known. And the last domain, well, no, I'm going to talk about two more, but the last domain is want the environment to be safe. So like NYU put barriers up in their libraries, Cornell fences on, nets under the bridges. They need to be window guards. Suicidal feelings and impulses are fleeting, and they pass, and they can pass quickly. So we want to make sure that means is restricted, right? And 90% or more of people who attempt suicide, right, they don't ever go on to die by suicide. They survive. Most never try suicide again. So this is a really sort of important space. And in our country, what that means for firearm safety and working with families about, safety around that is also really important, and fraught if not, approached the right way. Equity through everything I said, and equitable implementation. Who are the students? Who was that school built for? Who was it not built for? And how is that addressed? needs to be in the plan in a culturally competent and very, very specific way. And so we help schools do this, and we do it with we've completed the work of 4 years. We work with the colleges for 4 years. And we've done that work with about 250 or 270 colleges that have finished the program, another 250 that are currently in it. We work with individual high schools, that's a 3-year program, and with districts, it's a 4-year program. So it takes a long time. And our data is great in terms of the results, but I'll tell you that if the leadership's not committed, it doesn't work, right? And that turnover is devastating to the impact, and turnover in leadership is complicated. And we actually see schools do incredible work, and then a few years later, it falls apart. Because of leadership or distraction into other things. And we're trying to figure out as an organization, like, how do we then stay connected on an ongoing basis with schools? But this all ties into what I would say too is that, so we're in a remarkable time. The Surgeon General issued a youth mental health advisory, right? The American Association of Pediatrics issued an emergency declaration about children's mental health. In the Surgeon General's recommendations, he talks about supportive adults as being key, right? And so, school systems, but even outside of schools, being a supportive adult and mobilizing supportive adults is a big part of this, And when we talk to folks, and I'm the father of a 28 and 26-year-old, just to say, and so have some lived experience along that front. But it's important that we find the opportunities, and everybody who is an adult, if you think you're a supportive adult in the context of young people who do they know that? Like, you think they know that, but you need to tell them that, and have a discussion with them about what that looks like, right? So they'll know that they can come to you. So I'll make a few comments about the myths and the voids and the partnerships. So from a myth point of view, one of the things I wanted to say was, this is, let's talk about stigma, just in the context of young people. So stigma is absolutely a significant issue, and I'm not trying to say it isn't. But among young people today, what I would call stigma-adjacent issues are growing. And what that means is, so in research, and we just completed a big piece of research with 13 to 17-year-olds, they have a growing position or a lack of trust that helps, right? They have a growing mistrust of older adults and institutions. So I don't know that that's stigma. We don't have to argue over but I think it's important that we understand what that is. When they talk about their issues, they don't use stigma-type language, really. In fact, when you do a word map, they say they're drowning, they're in a tornado, they're in a storm. They use storm language, actually, overwhelmingly. And so there's, sort of something in there, I think, for us to understand. And when they talk about, and this is stigma perhaps, but I just think the specifics matter. They say they don't want to be judged, and they don't want to be labeled, right? And they're worried that those labels are going to stick with them. And so, I think that, in terms of myth or void, there's space in there that we really have to understand. And young people, mental health messaging used to be this. It used to be 20% of people, 1 out of 5, have an emerging mental illness. It's brave to speak up and seek help. You're not alone, right? And so, and then it sort of moved a little bit into, you got to take care of yourself, self-care, get good sleep, et cetera, do mindfulness, see a therapist. Young people today are saying, okay, excuse me, older adult, right? I am right to be angry. I am right to be anxious. I am right to be upset. And I don't want to just sleep it off, and I don't want to just, do a meditation app. I want the world to be a better place. And if you just want me to figure out how to suck it up better, right, then I'm not listening to you. And so my message in that is just to say, we're going to meet them where they are, listen to them, right, because that's not wrong, and so myth void, that's a point that I wanted to make. Also, I think a myth is this idea that schools are ready and have a safety net, just as Peggy said. Many don't, or they only have pieces of it. And so, that is a myth, and that's also actionable and something that we as a society can do. And when Peggy said we're complicit in it, yeah, I think if donors and funders and parents demanded it, it would happen in a quicker and more comprehensive way. Another point I just wanted to make about young people is they're willing to talk about mental health. That's not the issue that they say in research. They say that they spend a lot of time thinking about who to trust and who to go to and who's going to listen and guide and help, but not try to fix their problems and not make them bigger than they are or cause more trouble, right? Kind of space. And so I think there's some lessons for us in there. In terms of the void, I think this idea of collaboration, it takes a village. It takes it takes everybody, and it's everybody's business and place. And also that mental health and health are not separate. So we have these conversations about mental health, but it's a separate conversation about purpose and meaning in life. And it's a separate conversation about taking on, making the world a better place, and social justice and racial justice. And they're all overlapping. The Venn diagram is they're all completely overlapping, and we need to sort of look at it more holistically. And I think that it's a void that we just aren't looking at it that way, and that ties into the social determinants of health. And at BU, the public health school there is now really calling them the commercial determinants of health, which I think is completely accurate because commercial forces are so often driving that. So, and when we talk in more sort of holistically, purpose and meaning, so in youth surveys are coming up very, very low. We tend to focus on loneliness and we tend to focus on sadness, but the purpose and meaning scores are very low and might actually be more of the root issue than we're realizing. And I think that, there's places there for us to step in. Acceptance and love is part of this as well. And then in terms of the opportunities, I would just say I think boundaried communities, schools, employers, everything we said about schools is true of employers and how employers support young adults. And they have the resources, and we should put the same expectations on what employers are doing. And then, back to this idea of supportive adults and intergenerational or two-generational relationships, because actually young people, there's incredible loneliness and despair, growing in people in their 50s and their 60s and their 70s. So there's a incredible bi-directional opportunity there to actually enlist and activate young people to support the older adults in their lives, which will also benefit the young people. So thank you. Those are the thoughts I wanted to
such a wealth of knowledge in the high school and college landscape. Thank you so much.
We're going to shift gears a little bit on a different perspective in the mental health arena. Welcome, Dr. Amy McGuire. Dr. McGuire is the director of the Center of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. Her research focuses on the ethical and policy issues related to emerging technologies and novel therapeutics. She recently founded the Ethical Legal Implications of Psychedelics in Society program to study how psychedelics may be used to address our current mental health crisis. She's also been featured as a TEDx speaker, Crisis of Connection, you can find it with that title, which was focused on our current mental health crisis. She's received many, many awards and honors, but to name just one specific one was the Baylor College of Medicine Distinguished Educator, and she received her undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania, her JD from the University of Houston, and her PhD from the University of Texas Medical School. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you. Thanks. So first of all, I want to thank you, Sabrina, for having me here. This is such a delight to be here with all of you, talking about these really, really important issues that don't get discussed enough. And thank you to the Ortus Foundation and for all of your generous support of our work. Peggy, thank you for being up here. I know how difficult this must be, and for you to talk about this issue. And I think your perspective is so, so important, and really appreciate you having the courage to do it. And John, thank you for the work that you guys are doing, because I think it's really critical. So you'll hear some common themes in what we're talking about today. But my interest in mental health really was similarly stimulated, similar to I think both Peggy and Sabrina, and probably many other people in this room, by my own experience having 3 teenage sons who were all struggling in their own ways. And a couple of years ago, I was visiting one of my kids at college. So he was at the University of Texas at the time. His name is Tommy. And I took him and 2 of his friends out to dinner. And they were talking about a friend of theirs who had just passed away from an overdose of Xanax and alcohol. And they were really devastated by this, because this was otherwise a very, very, impressive young man who had a great, bright future ahead of him. But what really kind of struck me is that they didn't seem very surprised. And it wasn't because they thought this particular friend was struggling. He wasn't reaching out for help. He wasn't doing anything that I think some of their other friends, and they in fact were doing. But it was because it wasn't the first friend that they had lost, and they knew that it wasn't going to be the last friend that they lost. So I asked them at dinner, I said, how many people do you guys know who have your age? They were 20 years old, three kids. How many people do you guys know who have died from either suicide or drug overdose? And they kind of started talking about it, and between the 3 of them, they were able to come up with 9 names, right? Your statistics were surprising to me, and I shouldn't be surprised by that, but I did not know 9 people when I was 20 years old who had died from either drug overdose or suicide. So I was really, really astounded by this. And these are kids at college, right? They went to the University of Texas. They were all from relatively privileged environments. Most of them had access to all of the resources available to them, and this was still the statistic. So this conversation had a really profound impact on me, mostly because my thought at that moment was, there but for the grace of God, my kid could have been one of them, right? And I think that's one of the big myths, is when I have so many friends who are like, not my child. I'm like, let me tell you something. It's everybody's child. To think that it's them, not me, is a huge myth. But this had a really big impact on me, and I wanted to learn more about mental health. I wanted to learn more about why are so many of us struggling, and our kids are struggling, and what can we do about it? So I'm a researcher, and I decided to do what I do for a living, which is to try to study it. And through my research, I really discovered kind of 3 main points, many of which we've already touched on tonight, right? So the first thing that I discovered is we are most definitely in the midst of a mental health crisis. There's no denying it. Right? It's getting progressively worse, and it impacts every single one of us, whether it's directly or indirectly. So John talked a little bit about the statistics, which are pretty staggering, right? 1 in 5 Americans are currently suffering from a diagnosed mental illness. 40% of people report having clinically significant symptoms of anxiety or depression. I don't know if how many of you saw a couple years ago, Adam Grant wrote an article in the New York Times, I think, where he talked about those of us who are not clinically diagnosed with anxiety or depression, and the fact that we're not doing so great either, that most of us are just what he called languishing, right? We're just kind of waiting for the day to end, waiting to get home and either binge on Netflix or drink some wine, and kind of just, muddling through our lives in ways that are not healthy either. The annual spending on mental health services is pretty astonishing. It's increased in the United States from $171 billion in 2009 to $280 billion in 2020, with global direct and indirect costs of mental illness estimated to reach $5 trillion annually by 2030. And yet, the fact is that only a minority of people who are suffering actually seek mental health treatment, right? What do the rest of us do? We just either silently suffer, or we try to self-medicate in our desperate attempts to feel better. And it's exactly that kind of silent suffering and desperate attempts to self-medicate that I think my son Tommy and his friends were talking about, and that led to the death of 9 of their friends by the time they turned 20. So as John pointed out, suicide is, or I think Sabrina pointed out, suicide is the second leading cause of death in kids 10 to 24 years old. And just one more statistic is that globally, somebody kills themselves every 40 seconds. That's crazy to think about. The second lesson that I learned when I started doing my research, which is another thing that we talked about, is that mental illness is incredibly complicated. And there are many contributing factors, right? There's genetics plays a part, the chemical imbalances in our brains plays a part, stressful life events, all of this sort of things that we talked about in terms of the despair that we're feeling in today's society, trauma, and other things as well. And it is a problem that requires a massive coordinated public health response. So I'm going to talk about one way to kind of address this, but I don't want to oversimplify the problem. So I just want to point that out, that it really does require a multifaceted response. We need to do things that we've already talked about. We've got to reduce stigma and increase access to care. We've got to reform our entire education systems, I think particularly focusing on social and emotional learning so that our kids have the skills that they need to cope with adversity is something that we do a terrible job of and that we really need to address not just in the home, but in all of our education structures. We need to address structural violence and social injustice, which have plagued our society for generations, and that's like critical to this issue. But I'm going to talk about the fourth thing, which is that we really need to develop new treatments that more effectively help people who are suffering. So that brings me to kind of the third thing that I learned doing my research, which is the fact that effective conventional treatments for mental health do exist, but they often fail to durably benefit significant numbers of patients. So treatment response is very often incomplete. Side effects can be terrible of certain medications, and it can be extremely time-consuming because figuring out which drug works for the right person will be a exercise in trial and error, and it can take days, weeks, months, sometimes years to figure out what medication works and for the patient to experience some benefit. And these issues are really compounded for individuals with severe illness and groups with special kinds of trauma, such as veterans and war-affected populations. So this has led many people to explore novel therapeutics that can provide more immediate and long-lasting relief. And one class of these therapeutics, which we've been studying at Baylor, and I know a lot of other people in the room are familiar with, is psychedelics. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking a little bit about psychedelics, what they are, what does the research tell us about them, and what are some of the challenges and ways forward. So for those of you who are not familiar, psychedelics are a class of hallucinogens that bind with a specific serotonin receptors in the brain. And many of the classic psychedelics, such as psilocybin, or you may have heard that called magic mushrooms, mescaline, which is also peyote or San Pedro, or DMT, which is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, these have been used for millennia by indigenous populations. Others, such as LSD or acid, are synthetic products that were only synthesized in the 20th century. So regardless of their source, however, psychedelic drugs have been shown to increase the neuroplasticity of our brains. So this means that the way that they work is they change our neural pathways in some way. Some have described it as helping our brains get kind of unstuck, right? It's like changing the pathways of how you're thinking about things or uprooting pathological patterns of thinking and feeling. And then this in turn has been described as opening people up and priming them to see things from a very different perspective. So it's thought that when psychedelics are combined with intensive psychotherapy, it can dramatically speed up the treatment process. And in fact, some people have described, have said that what they're able to accomplish in just 3 sessions of psychedelic assisted therapy typically would take 20 years of traditional conventional talk therapy. Many have described the experience of being on a psychedelic as transformative or self-transcendent or even mystical. It often can produce feelings of, and this ties in a lot with what you were saying, John, it can produce these feelings of connection or oneness with others, with the universe, and that can create increased feelings of empathy, both for others and for ourselves. It can impact our mood, and it can shift our entire perspective on how we view the world and how we view life. So these effects of psychedelics were particularly interesting to me because when I was talking to my son Tommy and his friends, this is what they brought up. I said to them, why do you think you and all of your friends are suffering so much? You guys are in college, you're in your 20s, like these are supposed to be your golden years, like what's going on here? And they brought up the things that you were talking about, John. They brought up the fact that they feel overwhelmed, they feel too busy, that there's all this noise out there, right? And they talked about the fact that they feel really disconnected, right? They had this lack of meaningful connection in their lives. They felt isolated and lonely sometimes, even when they were surrounded by people. And they felt disconnected not only from themselves, from each other interpersonally, but they also felt disconnected from nature right? They felt disconnected from something bigger than themselves, just anything bigger than themselves. They felt like there was really no connection to that. And that really stuck with me, because that's exactly the problem that people who study psychedelics claim that it addresses. So what does the research on psychedelics tell us? I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the research because it's quite interesting. Actually, research in the United States on the therapeutic effects of psychedelics began in the 1950s and 1960s when LSD was first synthesized. And it was quite promising both for treating mental health disorders as well as addiction. However, unfortunately, there were many unethical research practices that were going on. Probably the one that you're most familiar with is the work that was being done at Harvard by Timothy Leary and his colleagues, where they were, the therapists themselves were taking the psychedelic drugs with their subjects, as well as making it widely available to individuals outside of a standardized research protocol. And at the same time, LSD had kind of gotten widely accepted into popular culture. And so there was a lot of public use of LSD and other psychedelics. This got very intertwined with what was happening both socially and politically at the time. So remember, we're in the 1960s. We've got the civil rights movement. We've got the anti-Vietnam War protests. We have anti-government sentiments all over the place. And the combination of all of this, and all of these people were sort of advocating for LSD and psychedelics, tune in, connect, drop out, those sorts of things. And all of this was a huge threat, and it led to President Nixon declaring his war on drugs in 1966 and Congress passing the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which classified all of the classic psychedelics into Schedule I, which means that they had a high potential for abuse and no known medical use, right? This made it incredibly difficult to conduct research on psychedelics, and very little research, in fact, was done over the next 40 years. However, there were some small fringe groups that continued to do research. They advocated very strongly for research on different psychedelics, and they continued to do some research under very strict regulations. And that research continued to be fairly promising. So it was the basis of that research that the FDA actually declared MDMA, which is commonly known as ecstasy or Molly, right, a breakthrough therapy for treating post-traumatic stress disorder in 2017. And they declared psilocybin a breakthrough therapy for severe depression in 2019. At the same time, in 2017, Michael Pollan published his book, How to Change Your Mind. How many of you have read the book, How to Change Your Mind? Right. So, best-selling book, very, very popular reception. It got translated into a Netflix series, and it's all about sort of the use of psychedelics and the potential of psychedelics for different treatments. And since then, we've seen a huge amount of interest in psychedelics and in psychedelic medicine. Based on most of the research, so the latest study was published actually last week by MAPS, which is one of the big organizations studying MDMA. And last week they came out with their phase 3 trial of MDMA that showed significant increase in treating post-traumatic stress disorder over placebo. And based on studies like that, it is anticipated, I think, by most people in the field that FDA is going to approve the first psychedelic medicines, which will probably be MDMA, within the next year. So in the meantime, other things are happening, right? So at the state level, people have gotten interested in this, and the states have started to decriminalize the use of psychedelics, making them available outside of the medical system. Already, Oregon and Colorado have decriminalized some psychedelics, and many, many other states and jurisdictions are considering similar legislation. I know some of you in the room are involved in those efforts as well. Even in states that haven't decriminalized, I think that the personal use of psychedelics seems to be more prevalent, or at least more open than it has ever been. It's kind of gone from really, really below ground to kind of being unearthed and a little bit above ground. And you can find articles now all over the popular press, right? So they talk about Silicon Valley companies that are holding psychedelic retreats to promote creativeness among their employees. I read an article recently about moms who are microdosing to deal with the stressors of parenthood. And we're actually studying almost 200 retreats that are being advertised in the United States and that are offering weekend escapes to improve general wellness through the use of psychedelics, right? So this is now popping up all over the place. So what are the risks and concerns with psychedelics? So psychedelic drugs are not thought to be addictive, like opioids or other substances. It's not thought that they have those same addictive properties. Although I will, as a caveat here, say that I do think that there is some concern about individuals who use psychedelics outside of a clinical context or for non-clinical reasons, who continue to use it regularly. And my understanding anecdotally of this is that those people are really sort of what I would call chasing the experience, right? They want to feel that connection, and they want to experience that self-transcendence that we talked about, and they have not figured out how to integrate that into their lives, which is part of the therapeutic process, without the drug itself. Another very different concern, we've talked a lot about stigma and mental health stigma, but another concern is that psychedelic therapies, when they are approved, aren't going to be available to those who need them the most, either because of stigma about the drugs or because of cost. So I don't know about all of you. I think Nixon's war on drugs was fairly effective. I grew up in that generation, and I was scared to death of drugs, right? Like, I saw those commercials that was like, this is your brain, and they'd crack an egg, right? And then they'd be like, this is your brain on drugs, and it would be a fried egg. And I was like, I don't want that. So I was very, very concerned about drugs. And I think a lot of other people in our generation feel the same way. Like, it was effective in that way. There's a lot of stigma around different substances, including psychedelic substances. And many of my friends who are both black and brown were told that they will go to jail forever if they ever experiment with drugs of any kind. So I think particularly in certain populations, there's a big fear around and a mistrust of the use of these kinds of substances, even in a therapeutic context. So it's not surprising that there's still stigma around the use of psychedelics for therapy. However, I think it's really, really important to distinguish between personal and recreational use of psychedelic substances and their therapeutic use. And it's important to understand that actually using psychedelics outside of the therapeutic context, it may not, and in fact it probably won't, produce the same therapeutic effects. The preparation and integration of the experience with a trained mental health professional, or at least a trained professional, seems to be really critical to the therapeutic process. And in the field, a lot of people talk about set and setting as being really important, right? It's the mindset of the individual as they go into the experience, and it's the setting in which they do the experience, and it's the preparation that they do for the experience and the integration that they do post-experience to really make sense of what that means for them and how to integrate it into their overall psychotherapeutic process. However, doing psychedelic-assisted therapy with a trained professional is incredibly expensive, right? It's very, very time-consuming. It requires hours and hours of one-on-one time with health professionals. And for many people, the costs may be prohibitive, which may drive them to seek out more affordable access outside of the healthcare system. So I think we need to be concerned about that and think about people who have really serious mental health disorders self-treating outside of the healthcare system in ways that might not be safe for them. So finally, I think the biggest risk, and the one that I spend most of my time studying and trying to avoid, is that the science gets ahead of the ethics and policy. And I think in some senses we're sort of already there. We saw this happen with psychedelics in the 1960s, and we don't want to see history repeat itself. And so in our group at Baylor College of Medicine, we're working really hard to do research on ethical and policy issues, to help develop best practices in this space, and to make sure that when psychedelic therapies do receive FDA approval, we're prepared for them to be integrated into the healthcare system in both a trustworthy and a responsible way. So, thank you.